Hi, I'm Adam Culp, and you're at Beachcast. Today, I'm going to talk about how to understand code written by someone else, or maybe even our past self. So stick around and we'll get right on that. Welcome back. If you want to grow as a developer and learn how to make better web applications, start now by subscribing to Beachcast and make sure to click the notification bell so you won't miss anything. And if you found this video helpful, or if you have a question, please leave a comment down below. Also, please remember to like the video by clicking the thumbs up button. Thank you. So last week I was asked a question by one of the Beachcast listeners. Their question was, could you upload a video about how to understand source code when you are trying to read? Well, I didn't understand that question exactly, so I answered back and with a more defining question, and I asked what they meant by that. Did they mean that they were reading source code and having difficulties, or was it somebody else's code? And you know, how I could best help them. So they answered back, yes, exactly. I have been struggling with it sometimes. I can understand, but sometimes I can't understand anything that the codes are doing. So with that in mind, I thought, you know what, that's a good topic. So let me go ahead and talk a little bit about that. Often we are working in code bases that have been around for a while. Maybe it's legacy code. We as developers spend a lot more of our time reading code than we do creating new code or writing code. And a lot of that is because if we're adding new functionality, if we're creating something in an application or changing something, oftentimes we have to read the code that is surrounding where we need to add this new functionality. We have to really examine the code to understand how we can add something to it. We really need to comprehend the design of the code before we can make changes to that design. So that introduces a lot of different potential problems. The first way that most people rely on is to read the code line by line, right? So you're going through sequentially, looking at the code one line at a time and trying to follow it. This can be problematic, especially in object-oriented code, because as you're reading line by line, then you get into a place where code from someplace else is called in. So instead of reading line by line, you end up following the execution. In web applications, oftentimes we have a front controller. So you follow the front controller into the application and have to follow along that way. One of the things that we also find helpful with that is in web applications, often there are what we call routes. So when somebody types in a URL, maybe it's like, mysite.com/customer/edit, or maybe it's just /customer/, and if it's a GET or a POST request, that dictates, what the code actually does. Maybe there is no additional path after that. Another way that folks find very helpful in analyzing code and figuring out what it's doing is by looking at the tests. If your code has unit tests as part of the code base, it's very easy to look at the test, understand what the intent of the code is based on the test, and then it helps to look through the code with the tests in mind and knowing what it's supposed to do. It makes it a lot easier to understand. Now, not all code bases have tests, but if it does, then it makes it a lot easier to go through and be able to understand the design and the intent of the application. If the code is object-oriented, sometimes it can jump around a little bit, and that's just the nature of it. You build nice little functions that are single purpose and easier to follow, but you might hop around a little bit. So what a lot of folks find helpful is to use step debugging. Now in PHP, there are a couple different step debuggers. The most popular by far is using Xdebug. Xdebug is kind of the standard in the PHP space for doing step debugging. It's an extra module that you install with PHP, and it enables then your IDE to communicate to PHP, and they communicate back and forth. And through that communication, it enables you to execute the line one code at a time in an IDE, so that way you can see how it's going. Well, that makes it very easy to understand the application, because then not only are you following line by line, but you're using debugging to do it one line at a time. And you can actually, at any point in time, analyze the variables, the contents of things, what an object actually holds inside of it. So not only are you following the execution, but you also understand the data that is following along within the application as you go. So step debugging can be a huge tool to help you analyze code, whether it's somebody else's or your own, and be able to do it that way. Now, myself, I use all of these methods from one time to another, but the number one thing that I find most useful when I'm inside a code base, whether it's my own code or whether it's somebody else's code, is refactoring. Refactoring is an amazing tool for analyzing code, because as you're going through, whether you're going through with a step debugger, whether you're going line by line, whether you're using the routes, or whether you're just following the execution path, oftentimes as you're going through and you're looking at the line, you're reading the code, you'll sometimes run into spots and you'll be like, wow, that's a lot of code in those few lines. And why aren't those somewhere else? Why aren't they, if I were, instead of having a few lines to do something, what if I was to take those few lines of code out, put in a well-named variable or a function call that could call to a function that now holds those lines of code? Well, what you can do, what happens through that refactor, is now you've got something that is named really well, and maybe you don't necessarily have to go look at the few lines of code that are in the function you just created through the refactor. In the future, you can just look at the variable or look at the function name, and it's nice and descriptive, so that way you don't have to follow along. So it can really make, through refactoring, you can clean up the code and make it a lot easier to read. Those are some of the main ways that I've found to go through the code and be able to read it and understand it better as you're going through. Now, with that in mind, there are some things that we can do in our code to make this easier, because reading the code is something that all developers have to do. And all developers spend more time reading their code than they do writing code, as I said earlier. The first way is through coding standards. If you don't have a coding standard set for your team or set for yourself as you're creating these applications, you should first decide on a coding standard. Having a coding standard and following it throughout all of the code base makes it easier when you come back later. As you're reading the code, you'll understand it more quickly because it follows the standards. You'll know where your functions start and stop. You'll know what variables are, how they look. You'll know how arrays might be specified. And you'll know how objects are being called and the naming around that, as well as the structure, your folder structure of your application, and how your objects and classes and functions would be better organized. Where do you keep all your vendor files from third-party code that you're including in your application? All these things are defined in a coding standard, so that way you can, again, make it easier for you to read later when you come back. If by following a coding standard, now you've reduced the amount of time that you have to spend reading code before you create new code. Another way to improve this for yourself is by using frameworks. Now, I know there are some people out there who say, I don't want to use a framework. I would rather write the code myself. And although I don't agree with that, it's okay as long as you are creating your own framework per se, so that way everything is nice and encapsulated. You're not including too much of the plumbing code throughout your code base. So you should have all your plumbing code in one place. By using a framework, you do that. You put all your plumbing code in one place, and then you put all your code that is the logic of the application, the way things function, in a different place. So that way you've got them separated. So if you were to decide to use a different framework down the road, or if you want to modernize your framework, but you don't necessarily need to modernize the rest of your code base, you can do that easily. Yet another way to help you with this is by using patterns. As I said earlier, if you're making an object-oriented application, using design patterns that are known, and most developers doing object-oriented program know these patterns. Again, it makes your code easier to follow. It makes the flow and the logic of the code easier to follow because you're using known patterns. Somebody can look at the pattern in the design of your application and say, oh, okay, that the developer used a factory pattern, the developer used an observer pattern, or a state, or something along that line, some sort of object-oriented pattern that most developers these days understand or are at least able to function with. And then, of course, there's always tests. Now, you could have unit tests, you could have functional tests. By introducing unit tests or functional tests, you do a couple different things. First off, your code is typically going to be a little bit cleaner. You're going to follow more conventions and more standards because then it's easier for you to write tests and make it easier for you to test your code. But the tests themselves give you a point of reference. So coming back in the future, like 6 months or a year later, when you come back to your code base, you can say, okay, what was this code supposed to do? I wrote tests. Let me go and read the tests, and then it helps me understand the code a lot easier. So tests are another great way to make sure that our application is built with high standards and much easier for us to read. So there you have it. These are the things that make it easier for us to read and understand code written by somebody else or possibly by yourselves. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please subscribe to the channel so you can see more videos like this in the future. Also, remember to hit the thumbs up button and like the video. So thank you for coming, and until next time, take care.